Welcome to the True North Fantasy Football Podcast.
What up, fantasy people, and welcome back to the True North Fantasy Pod. As always, Travis Seal here, live from Dirty Laundry Studios, and I've got my co-host Tyrell McLaughlin with me. Ty, what's cracking, buddy?
Same old, same old. What about yourself?
Not too bad, man. I'm doing well. It's typical Wednesday afternoon out on the West Coast here, a little bit cloudy, looking like we might get some rain. Hopefully we get some snow. I'm kind of hoping for that. One thing I did want to say, Ty, I forgot to mention last week when we had Graham on the pod, that was our 75th episode, buddy. So, 75 is 3/4 of a C note. It's been a fun ride, my man, and definitely appreciate all the work behind the scenes on the pod, buddy.
Absolutely. Yeah. It seems like a little bit of a fake anniversary, but I'll take it.
Yeah. We'll take what we can get here. You can find me on Twitter at TCL14 and find Ty at TNFF Tyrell. Ty's always dropping really good threads and stat information. I personally, for me, Ty, your research has been kind of second to none. But on that note, I have to say it's got to be second, because I think if I said it was first, it might be a disservice to our guest tonight. And joining us is the editor-in-chief over at Number Fire and FanDuel, the author of Late Round Quarterback and the host of the Late Round Podcast. Find him on Twitter at Late Round QB. Thank you for joining us tonight, JJ Zachariason.
What's going on, guys? I can't believe you're hoping for snow. Who hopes for snow, man?
Well, full disclosure, like, we live on the West Coast, and so we barely really get any. Like, it's like if we get like a good 3 inches, that's a huge day for us. We were talking before on the pod about the fact that I got like a plethora of children, so that's very exciting in my house when we get that snow. Gotcha. So that's kind of where that stems from. But definitely understand, like, when it's starting to go away is when you get sick of it, because it's just like black slush on the roads. Here is what happens for us. So man, it's good out here on the West.
I feel you. I moved down south to Charlotte, North Carolina, to get away from that stuff, up in Pittsburgh where I'm from. We would get a ton of snow growing up and all of that. I experienced all that. It's done. I do feel bad for my daughter that she's not going to have that same experience growing up, but I'm definitely over the whole snow thing for sure.
Yeah.
That's what snowboarding's for. So I am just so thrilled to have JJ on. I mean, JJ and CD Carter, just so everybody knows, are basically like, blame them for the reasons why even your know-nothingest league mate knows to wait on quarterback. But it is super cool. Like, the Late Round Podcast, I think, is inarguably the best minute-for-minute podcast in like fantasy football history. It's just such a treat, I think, for our listeners to have JJ on at this point too, because I don't think there's anybody really better at fantasy football in the off season, in my opinion, either. Like, it's Mr. JJ Zachary's king of process, if you ask me. But
thank you, appreciate that.
I seriously do want to ask you, JJ, like, you've really helped a lot of listeners kind of wade through the off season and wade through prioritizing what's important in fantasy. And, I've always been of that mindset. I've almost come to the point where I think the offseason is the most important part of fantasy in a lot of aspects. Like, the more gas you put in your fantasy truck, the further you can go when you hit the road come fantasy draft season, right? So I wanted to ask, is that actually a focus of yours? Because I think, more than just your ability to be a quarterback savant, it's actually your ability to articulate some of the things that fantasy owners should be focused on, the old process over results,
Yeah. I mean, I use the off season a lot to sort of refine that process and make sure that, heading into any season, I have a really, really strong high level understanding of what the landscape looks like, what strategies are out there, what strategies work, and all of that. And the off season is the time to be able to really dig into that stuff, because in season, it's just a constant, it's just the same 4 episodes that I would do every single week. And look, I enjoy doing them, but by the time you hit week 15, you're kind of over it in a way. I'm much more into doing a lot of the deep dives into these specific topics and looking at things like, quarterback rushing and how things have changed over the years, or looking at like how viable running back handcuff and that strategy really is for fantasy football. So, yeah, I mean, I think the offseason sort of gets overlooked by a lot of people because it's still, people are still very much looking at like things from a player evaluation standpoint, but I really try to dig into more of the high level game theory stuff.
Yeah, and you hear a lot of people say this is our favorite point of the offseason, and it is because we get to discuss a lot of the stuff that is very fascinating to us. And I think, me and you, Trav, said this a lot in the past. JJ's co-host, CD Carter, has written a book along these lines, but I think of fantasy a lot like a game of poker, right? Like that's one of the true beauties of fantasy is anybody can sit down and have a great time playing fantasy football, but you start applying some game theory, embrace the math a little bit, and it becomes profitable as well. And there's nothing, funner than smacking your buddies around in fantasy for sure.
Yeah.
True that. Yeah. And that's kind of like for me, Ty, like when I say that the two of your research is second to none for me is because like since tuning into the late round pod and since podcasting with you, Ty, I've gotten a lot more into that number stuff. And I definitely find it makes fantasy a lot more fun when you're digging around and you find a really good nugget that you don't think anybody's seen or whatever. So I love that. And I'm definitely enjoying the process myself. But gentlemen, before we talk a little bit about that Super Bowl matchup, which is what we're going to kick it off with, I want to give a big shout out to our sponsor, Monkey Knife Fight. MKF is the fastest growing DFS platform on the planet, centered around player prop picks. They've got games for all skill levels and a wide range of buy-ins to maximize that profit. If you go over and use our promo code TNFF on your first deposit for an instant match of up to $50, you can start making some cheddar today. So yeah, we want to just give a thanks to anybody who's jumped on and used the promo code and started playing. That is a huge help for us as a brand, as kind of an upstart brand trying to, make it in the biz like our guest tonight. That's a huge help for us when you guys go and do that. So we appreciate that. Again, it is monkeyknifefight.com, promo code TNFF, and you get an instant match on your first deposit up to 50 bones. So yeah, it's been fun working with those guys, and I'm super excited to get into the Super Bowl stuff. So we're not going to waste any more time, fellas. I'm going to stop yapping. I have a tendency to do that at the beginning of shows. I gotta work on that a little bit, I guess. But we're going to talk about this Super Bowl. We obviously have the Chiefs at the Bucs, and the Bucs are actually hosting the Chiefs in Tampa, which is really, really cool to see a home team make it. It's too bad they won't be able to have the full crowd because that would be insane for those Tampa fans. But when you look at that matchup, I think the biggest storyline is you got the old GOAT in Tom Brady against the young GOAT in Patrick Mahomes. So JJ, I'm curious to hear what you think about that matchup, because these guys are 2-2 in matchups head to head. Brady represents the NFC now, and Patrick Mahomes has kind of taken over his AFC throne essentially as the best quarterback in that conference, most winning quarterback, I guess, in that conference. How do you think these guys are going to perform on the big day?
Look, I think that we're looking at a potential shootout, probable shootout. You have a high over-under in this game. I actually think the over might end up hitting, mostly because, if you look at what happens with Tampa Bay, is teams against Tampa Bay tend to throw the ball a lot because Tampa Bay's rush defense is so strong. There's a great article over on 538 that discussed that last week and talked about how Tampa Bay's rush defense is just super, super strong, and it really does play into it being a funnel defense, and team they're daring teams to throw on them, which, is not necessarily the smartest thing in the world to do. But so there's a great matchup there for Kansas City to exploit that secondary, which I do think can be exploited. They obviously were able to do a lot in getting pressure on Aaron Rodgers last week, and they did that earlier in the season as well. But I'm not as nervous necessarily about what they will be able to do against a guy like Patrick Mahomes in this offense. There is some offensive line issues that Kansas City's dealing with that I'm a little bit worried about, but I'm not overly concerned about Mahomes. I think that he should have a huge game. And then, the one thing with Tampa Bay that I think is probably the most interesting in this matchup is that this Bruce Arians offense has traditionally, and they did it this year too, they like to throw a lot of intermediate and deep passes. And so we saw that with Tom Brady throughout the season. He had a high 15 plus air yard attempt rate. And a lot of people when he moved to Tampa Bay, they're like, oh, Brady can't throw it deep anymore. Really wasn't the case. I mean, he was always accurate on his deep balls. It's just that he wasn't doing it that frequently. Now he did it more frequently. He's getting in a groove a little bit with his wide receivers down the stretch, and then that's shown in the playoffs too. And they were super aggressive against Green Bay last week. The thing is, Kansas City is a defense that does pretty well against big plays. And so I don't know if those will be there the same way they were there against Green Bay. And as a result, I'm a little bit worried about what that Tampa Bay passing offense, I mean, they're going to be fine, don't get me wrong, but little bit worried about, how big of a ceiling they actually would have. And so overall, as a result of that, I actually think that I think the line is pretty efficient, regardless of where you get it. But I'm siding with Kansas City here. It's just really hard for me to not go with Mahomes in the way that this offense. I mean, the Chiefs in general, it feels like they can just flip the switch and they're all of a sudden they're gonna, oh, we're playing football now. Okay, yeah, sure, we'll play some football. Where they can get that double digit deficit and it doesn't matter. So I just think they're a better team. Tampa Bay feels like one of those teams that has great personnel, but the coaching isn't always there and they're not always scheming for that personnel per se. So I'm just siding with Kansas City overall in this matchup.
Yeah, I like it. Tampa is a 3-point dog at this point. We still have a lot of time left for the Super Bowl. Ty, I'm curious if you have any thoughts on how this one plays out.
Yeah, how could you not? Like, the storylines are kind of endless in this one, right? Like, the Chiefs reigning champs and probably the best team in football. Kansas City also beat the Bucs back in Week 12. That game was also in Tampa Bay, by the way. But the Bucs are just piping hot right now. They won 7 straight games, haven't lost since that Kansas City game back in Week 12. And it really does just go back to frickin' Brady versus Mahomes, right? Just 2 ultra generational talents. Torch passer, you mentioned in Brady, torch bearer, future torch bearer, I guess, in Pat Mahomes, 10th Super Bowl for Brady. Mahomes looking for a 2nd straight Super Bowl. So and you mentioned the games they played against each other. It's pretty remarkable that these guys have faced off against one another so often, so early in Mahomes' career. With the stakes being as high as they've ever been, this is kind of the rubber match. You mentioned Brady beating Mahomes twice, Mahomes beating Brady twice. So, and if I could just go pure sports talk radio here, Trav, I think this game's for all the marbles, man. Like, when me and you were old, sitting in the folks' home, arguing about who's the greatest quarterback ever, you better believe I'll be using the record for Mahomes versus Brady to point to his goatness, or vice versa. Long down the line, I think it does kind of come down to the quarterbacks, and it's a lot to do with what JJ touched on, where Brady and Arians, like, Tampa Bay has such a clear path to running the ball in this game, as opposed to obviously Kansas City running it on Tampa Bay's number 1 run defense. But Brady and Arians are going to want to throw the ball, right? And we've seen, when Mahomes and Brady have faced off, there's half of them been high scoring games, 2 overs, 2 unders, but the passing yards combined between those two is just off the charts. And you would think more points had been scored in those 4 games by looking at just these 2 guys' passing totals in those games. Mahomes has a sizable advantage in yards and touchdowns, while also throwing fewer interceptions in games versus Brady. And the most recent of those 4 was the game back in Week 12. We got the shootout stats from these 2 quarterbacks. It just wasn't totally reflected on the scoreboard. And that game was one of them that did hit the under. And I wanted to bring up quickly that Brady's interceptions were kind of the death nail in that game in Week 12. That game was one of Tom's career high 5 multiple interception games this year, by the way, which lends to that Brady going to the NFC, going under Arians, kind of operating in a little bit different fashion than he did in New England. And, he really cleaned that up since the Chiefs game, the multiple interceptions. But obviously we saw that surface last week. We all saw Brady's natural hat trick of interceptions in that game. And I bring that up just because, that rambling point that I'm trying to make here is that both when he's faced Mahomes and in 2020, it's actually been the GOAT who's made far more mistakes than Patrick Mahomes. And then, to everyone's point here, the defense for Kansas City matches up much better because of they were bottom 10 in air yards allowed and stuff like that. And, you look at someone like Mike Evans is going to be faced up with Rashad Breeland. Yeah, he scored a couple times in Week 12. Do you want to rely on the touchdowns? Do you think Scotty Miller vultures some of that deep passing work from Mike Evans? So kind of off Mike Evans. I like Chris Godwin. I like that matchup this week. Had a big game against the Bucs or against the Chiefs earlier in the year. Tyler Johnson, trendy player. Not really. I think he's a little sketchy as much as I like the talent. Yeah, and then Gronk, I think, is in a good spot too. I actually really like both tight ends in this game. Both defenses have struggled against the tight end. Gronk blew up against Kansas City earlier in the year. Kelsey's blown up against everyone over the past half decade. Broke the receiving record this year, 5 straight seasons as the tight end one. Not unlike Mahomes, kind of took the tight end throne from his Super Bowl opponent and in Gronkowski too. So I don't know, not a lot of ancillary pieces, not a lot of running game pieces that I'm interested in this game. Trav, we have tons of time to kind of dig in like a tick, for this matchup. But hopefully it is Rojo. I mean, Fournette's not the worst bet to score a touchdown. I just think there's so much ambiguity in both backfields that it's hard to kind of pinpoint who I like in a game where I see the game script being very pass heavy for both teams. And I just think it all comes down to, I think Tampa Bay just has such a tall order on defense, right? Like, first off, they have to look like the number one run defense. If that dam was to break at the worst possible time, Tampa Bay is definitely toast. And beyond living up to expectations of the run defense, they're tasked with that impossible task of stopping Pat Mahomes and Andy Reid, the most creative, awesome West Coast offense ever conceived. So I think Kansas City is just going to be impossible to stop when it comes to third down, yards after the catch, all that stuff. And Tyreek Hill, best deep ball passer, best deep ball receiver on this team, even if they can't get the West Coast chunk yardage and run the clock on Tampa Bay, I think, the Chiefs pretty much can win in any way. So give me the Chiefs. Andy Reid's like as famous as being deadly with an extra week of preparation as he is, as he used to be, not being able to get to the Super Bowl. So I think the conclusion there is Andy Reid plus Pat Mahomes equals Super Bowl glory.
LOVE. Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm siding with Big Red. As an Eagles fan, I always loved Big Red, and I was sad to see him go, and I root for him still. Even though he's got his ring, I'm still rooting for him to get a second. And I think, much like all of you guys said, I don't think I'm going to add anything to that because you guys pretty much tied a pretty bow on that one. But Chiefs are going to win it. And Ty, one last thing, you mentioned that when we're old and gray in an old folks home, I'm not going to an old folks home, buddy. That's why I had all these kids, is because they're gonna take care of me until I'm old and gray. So we can video chat each other. Maybe we can like hologram chat each other at the old folks home by that time. But I'll be getting pampered.
Yeah, I plan to be like just a Futurama style head at that point. Anyway.
I like that. Yeah. Well, how are you gonna do all your fantasy research if you don't have hands? I guess you could be doing. Yeah. Okay. Getting way off the rails here. Sorry about that, JJ. Ty, you were gonna jump into some quarterback talk with Mr. Quarterback himself in the fold. So why don't you do that?
Yeah. So the first thing I wanted to ask, like, kind of just to get JJ's perspective, because this man literally wrote the book on how to approach the position, but also because you and your co-host have streamed a quarterback and tracked it. You and CD Carter as a staple of the Living the Stream podcast. So you can put some experience to this as well. So just the big question, JJ, how has the quarterback position evolved since you first penned the late round quarterback?
Yeah, so, I published that book back in 2012. So I worked on it in 2011, published in 2012. So it's been some time now. I feel like an old man. But back in 2012 on the market side of things, we had 5 quarterbacks being drafted in the first 2 rounds of the draft. We had the QB 12 being drafted in round 8. Whereas last year, the QB 6 was being drafted in round 8. And obviously, even Lamar Jackson and Patrick Mahomes slipped outside often the first couple of rounds. Maybe in a more casual league, they were in the second round, but generally speaking, we're not drafting quarterbacks early. So from that perspective, things have definitely shifted a good bit. From more of a streaming perspective, like you noted, we've been keeping track of our Frankenstein streamer, every single year, where we're giving 3-ish or so quarterback picks that are rostered in a third or fewer of Yahoo leagues every week. We take the average of that, so we're not just taking the best pick. And then the thing that we don't have the advantage of, picking up Justin Herbert last week and then just streaming him for the rest of the season, because his percent rostered increases. But from basically when we started tracking that in about 2015, or maybe 2014, through before this past year, we were between QB 6 and QB 8 every single year with those picks. So, I would say that those numbers should technically be better because of the Justin Herbert example. But regardless, it shows you that you can most definitely do this. This year, though, it was QB 11. It was way, way worse than we've ever had. And I think there's a lot of reasons for it. I can dig into the reasons for it. I don't want to get too off track. You guys can steer me in whatever direction you want to steer me. But yeah, this season, this past season, things definitely shifted a little bit. And there, like I said, there's some reasons for it and whatnot. But, I think that the quarterback landscape in general, it went from being a very, very easy market to exploit year after year since I published my book. And then now things are changing a little bit.
Totally. And, I appreciate you letting me steer it a little bit just because I wanted to give you a break, JJ. You're always spitting all the numbers, so let us do it a little bit. You're a guest. You're a humble guest. So, just to accentuate what we're seeing at the quarterback position for fantasy right now, like in NFL history, guys, 24 quarterbacks have scored 350 fantasy points in a season. That's a pretty good marker for an elite fantasy season, right? Almost 92% of those spiked weeks have occurred after 2004. Almost 80% of them have come in just the past decade, pretty much the entire time since JJ released his famous book. 25% of all 350 fantasy point scores by a quarterback came this season. The chamber of liquid hot magma, just absolutely, that's been driving upwards. It erupted this year. 6 signal callers, over 350 fantasy points. That's more than the 5 years combined, the 5 previous years combined, more than all quarterbacks in NFL history before 2011 combined. And all 6 of those quarterbacks from this season, we're going to touch on shortly, JJ. And, you know, they're all top 20 all time now. And the other big takeaway from what you laid out there is just kind of the scarcity, right? Because we always want to be chasing those high variance seasons. Just a couple of years ago, we could find a Lamar Jackson in the double-digit rounds, like Kyler Murray a couple of years ago. But those quarterbacks who profile as true fantasy team difference makers, they're just getting more scarce the later into the draft we find ourselves. And I agree that we're going to end up having to take a leap a little bit earlier in our drafts. Meanwhile, having an elite fantasy quarterback seems to be becoming more important. And that's where I kind of want to steer it, because it was a huge part of being a league winner this year in your fantasy league if you didn't have Alvin Kamara. What I mean is the quarterback pool to choose streamers from was smaller this year. 21 quarterbacks hit the 200 fantasy point mark this year. That's the lowest since 2014. 5 fewer quarterbacks on the radar, so to speak, than last season. So JJ, do you think having an elite option at the quarterback position is becoming more of an advantage for fantasy owners in recent years, or is it heading in that direction?
Yeah. So, I mean, if you look at what happened, this season in particular, what we found was that, not only was rushing a bigger deal this season, if you look at top 12 quarterbacks and you split them by passing points per game and rushing points per game, both passing and rushing were up versus the last decade worth of seasons. But I think that if you look at the rushing points per game, that's going to be something that's a little bit stickier year over year than what we're going to see from passing. So, if you look at passing numbers this year, they were bonkers. They were absolutely nuts, which is why we saw, the numbers that you just spit out there. But the thing is that passing generally tends to regress. So if you look at like an Aaron Rodgers and what he did this year, is crazy high touchdown rate. Touchdown rate is generally a number that will regress heavily year over year. So, last season, Lamar Jackson, of course, he has his rushing floor, but you looked at his touchdown rate, you looked at what he did through the air. It's very obvious that regression was going to come. So that's the first thing, is that, instead of historically, we had these quarterbacks who would only run the ball and not really pass the ball that well. We now have these quarterbacks who are running the ball and passing the ball really well. And so you have this sort of like unicorn player that's popping up. And until we get, 12 quarterbacks that have that dual threat ability to a QB1 ceiling degree, then those quarterbacks are going to bring forth more scarcity and be a give you an advantage week in and week out. One of the things that I think the best way to sort of like frame this is that if you look at the last decade worth of data, and you plot average draft position on the x-axis and then points scored on the y-axis. So what you're looking at is our preseason expectation versus our postseason result, right? And if you look at the graph, there's zero correlation at the quarterback position between QB1 to QB12 if you're looking at the top 12 quarterbacks, which tells you that the QB12 hypothetically would have just as good of a chance to finish with the most fantasy points as the QB1 would in terms of ADP, right? So what that tells you is that the market has been very inefficient over the last, 7, 8, 9 years. This year and entering this year, it was very evident. And I wrote about this too. So this isn't just me like, talking hindsight and stuff, but, entering this season, you had a very efficient market and it was pretty obvious. You had, Josh Allen and Dak Prescott and Russell Wilson and Kyler Murray. And then obviously the guys at the top and, Deshaun Watson, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson. You had all these guys who had this really high passing ceiling, but also had this really high rushing ceiling. And what that meant was there was going to be a higher chance that the correlation that I was talking about, ADP versus postseason result, was going to be a lot stronger than what we had seen, the previous 8 or 9 seasons. And what that means is that they're now becoming, quarterback is actually now becoming more predictable than it was before. Where, back in the day when I first wrote my ebook, people would tell me that they're drafting quarterbacks early because they want safe bets, but they've never been safe bets. But now you're actually getting that. You're actually getting, because going into next year, we're going to have a pretty good idea. There's going to be some guys that jump in, and that we don't expect, that jump into the top 7 or 8 quarterbacks or so that are really giving you an edge. But we're going to have a pretty good idea of which quarterbacks are going to be good because of the dual threat ability, because of what's sticky year over year, and that's the rushing ability. So to answer your question in a less long-winded way, the importance of having one of those quarterbacks is increasing. Now, how long is that going to last? I don't know. I think what needs to happen is we need this influx of talent and dual threat ability to come from college, which we are kind of getting this year, right? So if even 2 of those quarterbacks hit, then all of a sudden we're in a position where, we could probably wait, because the QB 12 is going to be someone like, let's say Justin Fields hits or something. It's going to be someone like that we feel comfortable with. So there's no reason to, get a Dak Prescott in the 5th round or whatever. But overall, things are definitely changing, and the need to get one of those guys is a lot different than it was 2 or 3 years ago.
Totally. And it's not just the volume and stuff. Like, the rushing pretty much was up across the board and ultra historic, especially the touchdowns. JJ laid a lot of that out on the most recent episode of at the late round pod. But yeah, it really is just the passing touchdowns and the efficiency across the board. Like, usually when you see volume go up in any aspect, the efficiency is going to come down. That's not been the case with rushing quarterbacks. We've actually seen the efficiency go up, as well as quarterbacks and schemers and offensive minds have become better at harnessing these traits from these quarterbacks. But you feel free to answer this right in the middle if you want, JJ. But like, was this an outlier season, or do you think the quarterback toothpaste is out of the tube for fantasy at this point?
Yeah, look, I think that there's going to be some regression through the air, like I said. It was definitely a different season than we've ever seen. But, the thing is, whenever we see these numbers that just like look out of whack and they don't make any sense, I try to find something to point to and say, this is why this happened. Otherwise, we can't really hypothesize very strongly as to why that happened, right? And so if you look at what happened this year, well, the obvious thing is that it was this COVID season, right? Where we didn't have any preseason games. So, one of the things that was really interesting entering the season was that if you looked at the biggest comparable to this season was probably 2012, which was the near lockout season. I think it was 2012, either 2011 or 2012. And that season, entering the year, the first few weeks, overs hit at a crazy rate. And what that told me, and it makes sense logically, was that defenses, we always think that offenses aren't going to be prepared because it's the way our brains work, because we only care about offense. But realistically, defenses need to work in unison more than offenses do, because offenses know what they're doing, right? So what we saw this season, same exact thing. Overs hit at a really crazy rate to start the year. Quarterback, Russell Wilson had a 13% touchdown rate through the first 3 weeks of the season. We had some crazy numbers from quarterbacks, and then it sort of calmed down a little bit, but the numbers overall were still higher than what we typically see. Now, do we credit all of that to being this pandemic season? I don't think we can credit all of it to that, because offensive holding calls were down this year. That's going to extend drives, and you're going to score more points that way. There's more play action going on throughout the league. That's going to increase efficiency as well. But there are at least some things. The other thing too with no fans is that opposing offenses and quarterbacks are able to dictate more at the line of scrimmage than they otherwise would, which is part of the reason I'm sure that home field advantage didn't mean as much this year, not just because of fans and all that, but because the quarterbacks and the opposing teams were able to dictate a lot more than they typically dictate, right? And so I think all of that combined, there's some reason why these numbers were the way they were, but I do think that every year, generally speaking, we're going to see a little bit of a step up in terms of offensive production. Like if you look at a chunk of a 3-year NFL span, it would be surprising just given the way the rules are changing and given the way offenses operate. And usually, defenses are trailing offenses. Offenses do one thing and then defenses sort of react to that, but then offenses are the next one to do something new, and then defenses react to that. So you're always going to see offenses getting better and better. But I do think that this season there was just such a big jump that it would be pretty surprising if we see this maintain, especially at the same rate of increase.
Especially if we keep seeing, I love that conversation because we've seen a lot of that with cover 3, like defenses love running cover 3. So everyone's going to this wide zone offense. So that's why we've kind of seen a lot of this outside zone scheme run games popping up all over the league. I love those kind of conversations. And I think you touched on something really perfect, like kind of hit the nail on the head, in conversation there. And that's that it probably is like some of the sustainability of this, especially in the passing game. Like you mentioned, it probably is contingent on that influx of talent at the position. I really like what you said there. And just to put some numbers on this, like the touchdowns are definitely going to come down. Like obviously we saw 863 from the quarterback position through the air this year. That was an all-time record, almost a 5% touchdown rate for the league. That is just ridiculous. And JJ, you pointed out how unstable touchdown rates are. So that's definitely just one category that we can point to for regression. But, we can't pay attention. We can't pretend like this, some of this isn't, that's why we're calling it kind of the bottleneck of the quarterback position, because it is just really bleeding over to such an efficient market. Like you mentioned last year, it's really incredible how it's all kind of come together. And we definitely seem to be paving a new frontier at the position. What do you think, Trav?
Yeah, I think it's pretty awesome. Like, just kind of looking at some quarterback stuff. If you look at the top 12, there's only 4 guys who didn't run for at least 200 yards. And I think for myself, like I used to be the type who drafted with that passing stability. And like a couple of years ago when Lamar was coming out, I really didn't think he was somebody that I was going to want on my teams, but I've definitely shifted that mentality, which is something that as fantasy players, we've got to make sure we're prepared to do when needed. So it's something that excites me a little bit more because it's just another strategy to work your team around, right? If you draft one of those guys, it brings more strategy into those later rounds, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it's fun times for sure.
Yeah, and just really quick, like we saw the most completed passes by quarterbacks. Like it wasn't just the rushing production. You can listen to the most recent episode of the Late Round Podcast, and you can get some of those ridiculously just unbelievable numbers. But the passing was also something that's going to get swept under the rug a little bit. We've seen, the highest completion percentage of all quarterbacks combined 3 years straight consecutively completed passes. And that's really interesting to me because it is the efficiency that's going up. It's not necessarily the the attempts or the passing yards for that matter. We saw more in 2015 and 2016 than we saw in 2020. But yeah, that efficiency as teams kind of get away from that old boys club and embrace some of the Kellen Moores and the Joe Bradys and the Eric Bieniemys. Who's the other guy who doesn't have a job? Because I'm trying to be sort of ironic here. But
can't remember.
There's a handful of thank you, Brian Dable, who should be in Los Angeles. Yeah, so I think a lot of coaches are coming around to the fact that we need to be putting the ball in our quarterback's hands more often than not, and hopefully we see this become a little bit more sustainable. But definitely those touchdowns and stuff will come down a little bit. Yeah,
the crazy thing. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt there. The crazy thing, the one stat that really jumped out with the rushing stuff that you were alluding to. I tweeted this one day, but if you look at the last 9 years of rushing touchdowns at the quarterback position, so I'll just read 2016. I'll just read from 2016 on, but 2016 there were 65 rushing touchdowns from quarterbacks. 2017 66, 2018 71, 2019 80, and then this past year 126. It just completely blew up. It was crazy. So I had to at least throw that one out there because it was when I was just going back and looking at stuff, it was one of those insane things that I saw that happened this year.
It was just insane. Yeah. And I think that's 47 more than last year, if my math's right. And I think there was a year around 2013 or 2014 where there was exactly 47 rushing touchdowns by quarterbacks. So it's just incredible that it's almost tripled in half a decade. And I think that is why it goes to the whole fact that, coaches are embracing the traits and coaches are unleashing these weapons and owners are more willing to invest in these pieces. And I think it's just one big slippery cyclical slope. And I think hopefully it doesn't, do a 180 in the next half decade or anything.
Can you say that 10 times fast real quick, Ty? Slippery cyclical slope.
I don't even know what I said. Yeah.
All right, so we're gonna dive in here at the True North Pod. We love doing player situation talk and dives. We are going to talk about some of the players who made up the sum of those parts that these fine gentlemen were just talking about. So JJ, real quick, I'm just going to list off a group of 10 quarterbacks, or 12 quarterbacks. Don't mind my math. Ty, your math is the one that's on point, so we'll leave that to you. And we're going to get into the nitty gritty in a second, JJ, but I'm going to give you this list. And I just want you to tell me how many of you guys think how many you think of these guys will go within the top 100 picks. So let's say around top 9 rounds. So I'm going to list these guys off here: Mahomes, Kyler, Josh Allen, Deshaun Watson, Lamar Jackson, Dak, Justin Herbert, Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson, Joey Burrow, Ryan Tannehill, and Tom Brady. So top 100 picks. How many do you think are going in there, JJ?
I have 8.
You
I
have
think 8 will. Yeah. Should I name the ones that I think won't?
Yeah, do that. Yeah, because I think I have the same number as you looking at the list here. So
I don't think we're going to see Herbert, Burrow, Tannehill, or Brady. I think those are the 4 that would not be. So I think, because the rest of the guys, I mean, Patrick Mahomes, he has dual threat ability, but it's also Patrick Mahomes. And then the only guy of that group that doesn't have the dual threat ability is Aaron Rodgers, but we know how this works. We see this every single year. Guy has a crazy, crazy touchdown rate season. The next season he gets overdrafted and his touchdown rate falls, and everyone says, why didn't Aaron Rodgers work out? Well, it's because this is math. This is what happens.
For sure. Yeah, I think actually now that I look at it again, I'm kind of on the fence on Herbert. I think some people could kind of get a little bit of that mentality that you were talking about for Aaron Rodgers with Justin Herbert because he's the new hotness. But it's going to be an interesting watch because I think we're seeing a real influx of a lot of young talent that's really exciting to have on our rosters. I know, like, especially with the rise of Superflex, if you have 2 of these guys on a Superflex roster, you are stoked about that because lots of talent. So we're going to get into the first guy here, JJ, and that is Kyler Murray. So we saw Kyler in his second season finish as the quarterback 4. Another one of those big rushing upside quarterbacks. He ran a lot this year. I'm curious, though, because he did have that spike touchdown season of 11 rushing touchdowns. I'm curious if you think that he can maintain those top 5 finishes moving into the future, even if he doesn't have that spike touchdown season. So obviously some of that would have to come with improvement as far as passing numbers, but I'm curious to see what you think about his situation and whether he can keep it up.
Yeah. So, obviously if you're going to maintain top 5 finishes, you got to hope that your competition drops too. So, everything that we talked about, hopefully we do see some regression for Kyler Murray's sake. With other quarterbacks, because then he'll be able to maintain it a little bit easier. But to your point, yeah, I mean, he's not going to probably repeat 11 rushing touchdowns per season. I don't think we can bank on that. The thing that was weird and not great for Kyler this season was his deep ball passing. He basically decreased all of his numbers on deep ball passes. I mean, his completion percentage on them dropped by about 4 percentage points this year. He just wasn't doing anything more with throwing the ball intermediate and deep. And that's kind of a scary sign. I think that the hope for Kyler is that he's only been playing in the league for 2 years and he can just improve naturally. We're not talking about someone who's 30 years old. So that can obviously happen, but yeah, I mean, I think that he can, sustain top 5 finishes. I just think that he needs to improve on that angle and that aspect of his game because, deep ball passing is very, very important for fantasy purposes.
Yeah, for sure. Like I think there's some room for him to improve on that too, because I do expect Arizona to kind of add a little bit behind DeAndre Hopkins in that wide receiver core myself. So I think there could be some room for that. They seem to use Christian Kirk as the deep threat a lot this year. And I didn't really think that was necessarily the right role for him. I thought he was more of a short A-dot, kind of after the catch type of guy getting those short targets, but he was being used down the field quite a bit. So I think if they retool, there is some room for that as well, because if you look at, like, I was also surprised that they didn't even hit 600 passing attempts this year in such a high volume play offense. They had the 4th most plays, but the 15th most passing attempts. So I think as Kyler kind of gets more command of that Kingsbury offense, I think there is some room for that to go up. And if that goes up, I think his 26 touchdowns, there is some room to improve on. But yeah, that rushing is the key for Kyler, of course. As we saw this year, because he ran wild and he only had 4 games outside of quarterback 1. So 4 games outside of the top 12 is pretty incredible, and 7 games over 30 points. So that's how you really unlock Kyler. And I don't think that's going to stop, but I love what you said there, JJ, because I think he definitely needs to improve and take a little bit more command of that offense. And I think some of the right players alongside could do that for him.
So, probably one of the best dual threat quarterbacks out there when it comes to both facets of, our fantasy attractions, the deep passing and the rushing profile. If not, it's definitely this guy, JJ. It would be Josh Allen. And you were very vocal about targeting Josh Allen in 2020, Mr. Mid-round quarterback. Did you end up scooping up lots of shares of Josh Allen this year?
I did. He was my highest rostered quarterback. And look, I don't say that again. I don't say that as like a back pat thing. It's just the way that the research really showed. I go by the research that I publish and the research that I talk about. And it really talked and showed that he was the last guy in that tier that had that true QB1 ceiling. So I just attacked it, and I got him in a lot of leagues. I mean, I also got, I looked at like a Joe Burrow late sometimes, or like a Cam Newton late. But yeah, Josh Allen was someone that, look, I didn't expect the season that he had at all, right? But I did think that it was at least in his range of outcomes, and it just ended up hitting.
Totally. And I thought, especially for like a best ball perspective, that he would give you like that stretch of games for sure, at the very least. And I mean, a pretty big win drafting Josh Allen this year. He was the difference maker at the quarterback position, and it wasn't really close. If you look at best ball win rates on rotoviz.com for MFL 10 formats, and just for our listeners, it's pretty much just the percentage of teams who drafted Josh Allen who won their best ball league. Simple as that. Josh Allen had a 16.6% win rate this year in 2020. Only Mahomes in his record-setting 2018 season and Lamar last year, those are the only two guys who have higher win rates in the past half decade than Josh Allen. But, the following seasons, these guys' win rates do a total 180, not unlike their touchdown rates. It happened to Pat Mahomes in 2019, happened to Lamar Jackson this season. As their average draft positions rise from rounds 10 or 11 to rounds 2 or 3, the win rates just crater. So thinking about Josh Allen in that context, his third-year explosion this season was just unbelievable. About 45% of all his fantasy points now, almost broke 400 points. So I'm not asking if this was a Cinderella season from Josh Allen, but do you have any concerns that in 2021 drafts that we're going to be paying career year prices for Josh Allen? And are we in or out at prices?
Yeah, we definitely are going to pay some crazy high prices. And, generally speaking, I think that this year of all years, or, entering 2021 in this season, we're going to have less of an idea of where these quarterback ADPs are going to actually land than we've probably ever seen. I mean, there's just so much ambiguity because of what we saw. I mean, we saw these quarterbacks, this group of quarterbacks actually give you an edge and be important in fantasy football. When, we have this sort of like dissonance of like people not wanting to draft quarterbacks early. So where's it going to land? I've done a lot of research that shows that opportunity cost in your drafts usually falls off, and opportunity cost being simply, what did you miss out on when you made this choice? So when you're drafting a quarterback in the second round, everyone says, oh, look, I got Lamar Jackson, I got Patrick Mahomes, but you really should be saying, well, I missed out on these running backs and wide receivers, which are way more important positions. And the hit rates at those positions early in drafts is a lot greater as well. So it's really important to know where the drop-offs occur in terms of hit rate at running back and wide receiver specifically. And what I found is that usually round 3 to 4 is where opportunity cost really starts to take a nosedive. And so if you want to give that a little bit of a buffer, you could say mid 4th round is where you should be looking at like the truly studly quarterback. But the problem is, if you think about Josh Allen, where's he going to be ranked? Maybe QB2 next year behind Mahomes. I think that's probable just given the way that he finished the season, right? And so if he's QB2 next year, let's say Mahomes goes in like round 3, and then Josh Allen's like right there. But the tier, the guys that we just talked about, the 8 guys that I think could be top 100 picks, I mean, all of them have a QB1 type ceiling in some way. So you're kind of overpaying for that tier in a way. And so, on top of that, you're going to see some regression. I do think it's good that you can pinpoint, the fact that like Josh Allen had the biggest step that we've ever seen one year to the next of any quarterback ever this year. Like it's not even hyperbole. This is bigger than what Jared Goff did from year 1 to year 2 when Sean McVay got there. I mean, this was insane. At least you can pinpoint and say, well, they added Stephon Diggs, who's one of the best wide receivers in the game, right? So at least there's something there. And then the other thing with Josh Allen is that he does have a good baseline rushing. And we've seen his rushing touchdowns be pretty stable. He had 8, 9, and 8 rushing touchdowns over the last 3 years. So at least that floor is going to be there. I just don't know if he's going to hit the same passing ceiling. So unfortunately, I'm probably not going to have a lot of Josh Allen next year, but I do think that he should be ranked, as the QB2.
Yeah, I like that, JJ. And one thing you talked about with Kyler was his deep passing. Well, Josh Allen improved quite a bit as a deep passer. He was up to about 46% completion rate as a deep passer. That's 20% more than the previous season. Completed 33 deep balls this year after only 18 last year. So that almost doubled. I mean, it's funny because it looks like it's Diggs, but all of those guys are really set up for that. Like Cole Beasley got his fair share of deep targets. Gabe Davis, I think, had the most on the team. So I think that offense is really set up for Josh Allen. And aside from the passing, like you said, JJ, it's death taxes and at least 8 rushing touchdowns for Josh Allen at this point.
Yep. And Dable should be back. That's some good news.
Which is huge for him. I think that is massive for Josh Allen, especially with the rate that they played with 4 wideouts on the field last year. That was a big surprise that I'd like to see. The next guy, we've talked about him a little bit, JJ, that would be Lamar Jackson. You mentioned that touchdown rate from last season. It was 9%. So almost 1 of every 10 passes that he threw last year went for a touchdown, which was insane. That came down to just under 7% this year. And obviously we know that that's a low volume passing offense. And then we saw a dip in efficiency as well. I'm curious, do you think with that passing, is he capped a little bit as the quarterback one on rosters? Or do you see him maybe bouncing back and finding that happy medium between 2019 and 2020?
I don't know if he bounces back per se, but I think that it's okay, right? Like I still think that what he did this season is as a baseline, if you will allow him to have a QB1 ceiling, not QB1 as in top 12 or top 10 quarterback, but the QB1. I think he showed that he has that ceiling, year in and year out. I mean, yeah, his numbers dropped. They weren't going to be sustained. We weren't going to see Lamar Jackson do that year in and year out. But at the same time, this season, he still averaged 22 points per game. I know that he got a big boost down the stretch with an easier schedule, but easier schedules happen. That's, it's not like you can't fault him for that. And the good news too is that yeah, right. The good news too is that his rushing was still pretty strong, and he was able to maintain a lot of what he did on the ground. He saw a little bit less volume and a little bit less, fewer rushing yards, but the rushing touchdowns were still strong. He was still a huge part in that offense in the red zone. So I'm not concerned about him being a QB1. I still think he has that ceiling. And then obviously if they get more weapons, and they beef up the offense a little bit from that perspective, then yeah, I mean, he can have a strong passing ceiling that spikes, and then all of a sudden he's in, that true difference maker range. So yeah, I mean, Lamar, what he does with his legs, that's what's important. And then, if he just has rather than just like a slightly above average season passing, he has a well above average season passing, then you're going to have another unicorn year like we saw in 2019.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think it's weird to me because a lot of people are really, really dogging Lamar and they're saying they're off Lamar because of what happened this year. But I think that's a little bit short-sighted in that we don't need 4,500 yards and 40 touchdowns from Lamar. We need 3,000 yards and 25 touchdowns maybe. And Ty, you're talking about all those 350-yard seasons. You give him that 3,025 touchdowns and 800 rushing yards, which is low for him. That's 300 points right there. That's not including rushing touchdowns. Obviously, doesn't include interceptions and fumbles and whatnot. But if he can get anything more than 3,025 passing, as well as 800 rushing yards plus those rushing touchdowns, I think he could be one of those guys that hits 350 multiple more times in his career. And I think it's a little bit early to be off Lamar because we knew what that offense was. And so we should have seen that regression coming, like you said, JJ, earlier. So I love that. I'm still in on Lamar myself.
Yeah, you never should be out on anybody who has that range of outcomes, right? That 400-point range of outcomes is just something we're chasing in 2021 all of a sudden at the quarterback position. So the next guy is somebody who also has that in his range of outcomes, in my opinion, Deshaun Watson. JJ, there seems to be some serious smoke to the Deshaun Watson trade rumors, and sort of seems like the Jets would be the front runners too. Deshaun seems down with gangrene, and the Jets seem to have, they have some serious draft capital to make it happen. So do you think he is on the move, and do you think the Jets make sense?
I do to both questions. I mean, wherever Deshaun Watson goes, he's gonna ball out. I mean, he's probably the most underrated quarterback in football, if we're being honest. So yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely I think that all of this is real. And I think that what we're seeing across the league is that quarterbacks know that they have similar to what we saw in the NBA, like 10 years ago or 15 years ago, where they know they have all the leverage. And to me, it's fun. It's awesome to see, right? I mean, they know that they don't have to be literally owned by these owners.
Yeah,
and so they're saying, I'm worth this, and I'm not going to play for someone who I don't agree with. And so they're leveraging that. And so with Deshaun, wherever he goes, I think he's going to ball out. And if he goes to the Jets, then give me all the Denzel Mims.
Oh,
yeah, buddy.
Giddy up.
I mean, he was playing
up.
at an MVP level in a dump of an environment last year. And I think there's still some ceiling to capture from a fantasy perspective. Like Deshaun scored more fantasy points per game as a rookie in that injury-shortened 2017 season than he did this year. And in every season since 2017, he has had a win rate in best ball of 10% or higher. He's the only quarterback who can say that in back-to-back years. And equally impressive is that he's also had the highest ADP by far among quarterbacks with a 10+% win rate in 2019 and in 2018. So he's kind of been a perfect mix of an elite quarterback for fantasy, but also still retaining some value in fantasy drafts. And I feel like gamers will probably end up reaching for other quarterbacks who are more sexy options, and Watson could actually be the one we attack at the back of that second elite tier this year. JJ, do you think like he'll be less enticing in year one if he's in a brand new environment though, or are you going to be, it seems like you're pretty in either way?
Yeah, I'd probably be in either way just because he's just so good. Depends where his ADP falls too, but I could see a lot of people thinking that way too, right? I mean, he's coming off a season where he was really, not in the forefront because his team sucked. And people were more interested in like the Josh Allens of the world. So I think that carries some weight in terms of how ADP looks the following year. Then if he's on a new team too, like, yeah, we can make the argument that, he has to learn a new system and he has to, which, I mean, there's been a lot of changes in Houston anyway, but that he has to, he's in a new environment and that might be difficult, but if that's baked into his ADP, then it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I think he probably will get moved to the Jets. And I like that too. Like, I think like I'm one who kind of roots for those losers to kind of turn it around. And oftentimes you got to slog it out. But if they can get a Deshaun Watson, like you said, they got Mims, they got Crowder. Maybe we have a Herndon sighting with Deshaun Watson in there. He's previously loved his tight ends, especially in the red zone. So I really like that landing spot as well. And I kind of hope to see it because I want him to get to somewhere where he's happy. And that big market in New York would probably love them some Deshaun Watson. So it's going to be an interesting quarterback carousel overall this offseason. I'm super excited to see all the movement. One other guy who is actually a free agent technically is Dak Prescott. So obviously he had that injury after playing 5 games this week, but he was on his way to having a monster year, JJ. He was actually the quarterback 1 in points per game. And in those 5 games played, he still finished the season as the quarterback 31. So that just kind of shows the tear that he was on in that Kellen Moore offense, Ty, like you said. So JJ, do you think he's back in Dallas next year? And if so, do you see him closer to kind of that top tier of top 12 quarterbacks, or do you think he's more towards that back end?
I think that he will be back, yes, and I think that he will be closer to the top than the bottom. I mean, it's really, really hard to bet against those weapons that they have there. I mean, it's arguably the best trio of wide receivers you can find across the league. And the crazy thing about Dak Prescott and what he did, obviously volume was on his side this year. Not only did the defense suck, so they were in negative game scripts, but that's the way this offense is operated with Kellen Moore, which is, I mean, we love it from a fantasy perspective, right? And then, Dak can do stuff with his legs and, he'll score some rushing touchdowns. He had 3 in 5 games this year. But the one crazy thing about Dak's season, I know it was cut short, so we have a small sample size. He had the lowest touchdown rate of his career this year. So he hypothetically could have been more efficient throwing the ball than he was. And so that just makes it even more intriguing moving forward. So yeah, I'm definitely going to be in on Dak next year.
Yeah, I like that. I'm with you that he's probably towards the top there. I actually am just looking at my rankings right now, and I have him as the dynasty quarterback 8. But I could see him moving up ahead of Russell Wilson and really competing with the rest of those guys because, like we've talked about on most of this episode, like that's a big group of guys that we're all happy to have them as the quarterback 1 on our teams. And I think one big thing we talked about Dable coming back for Josh Allen. I think Kellen Moore not getting a head coaching job is really good for Dak Prescott because I don't really want to see Mike McCarthy take over that offense. And Ty, you know what? I'm just going to call it for you. Kellen Moore 2022. JJ, we've been calling this since what was it 2020, Ty, where you were calling Kellen Moore, get this guy a head coaching job and get him in Dallas.
I just think these are the guys. Yeah, Joe Brady. Like these are the guys that should be getting some of these head coaching jobs because I number one, it goes down that rabbit hole of having a defensive guy, and then you put all the pressure on your offensive coordinator. If he's good, you lose him. If he's bad, you fire him. Like there's so many reasons that I would just give this my head coaching job. And I know there's a leader of men aspect to that conversation, but I think they're trendsetters, right? Like they're trying to stay ahead of the trends that the NFL defenses are setting. And it's clearly working. Let's put it that way. And, I know this is a quarterback conversation, but buy Amari Cooper, buy Michael Gallup, buy CeeDee Lamb, especially with that touchdown tidbit from JJ. I think CeeDee Lamb hopefully carves out a bigger niche in that area of the field. Next year, I wouldn't surprise me if he has like a dozen targets inside the 10-yard line next year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was an interesting red zone target distribution this year with Dak in there, and hopefully it continues to move into CD's favor because I love that. Ty, why don't you kick us into the next guy here?
Yeah, was it Justin Herbert, I believe, is our next
Herb kid
guy.
himself.
Yeah, the Herb kid. So one of the best rookie seasons we've ever seen, third best points per game season by a rookie quarterback since 1992. Second most passing yards, broke the rookie touchdown record for quarterbacks. Herb kid had 31 passing touchdowns, added 5 with his big, long, sexy legs. Not a dad runner, JJ. So what are your thoughts on Herbert relative to where he's going to go in fantasy drafts next year? Because I actually, it kind of surprised me. I thought he might go in that 8th or 9th round range, but it seems like you think he might end up as a value next year.
Yeah, I mean, he might. The other thing, too, with Herbert is that he's really athletic, and he didn't really show off those legs as much as he could have this past year. So there's someone that people often comped him to or like thought that he could have the type of career of is like a Josh Allen type where he's running the ball a lot more than he did this past year. So that's, there's some upside there at least. The other thing to keep in mind with the Chargers is that there's a new regime there. So things are changing. And Joe Lombardi is their offensive coordinator now. He spent 2 years in Detroit. That was the last time he was offensive coordinator. Then he was quarterbacks coach in New Orleans. But when he was in Detroit, the Lions were 1st and 7th in overall pass rate, and then they were 16th and 2nd in neutral script. So they were a fairly pass-heavy team when he was leading the Lions. Now, personnel matters and drives that too. But if you look at the personnel for the Chargers, you should and could easily say that they should be a pass heavy team. So I'm excited about the change because obviously they were really conservative this year. And I do think that Herbert can bring a little bit extra with his legs and his rushing ability. So as a result of that, I do think he has a crazy, crazy high ceiling. And if his ADP does fall, he would be a really good late round quarterback option, I think.
Yeah. And, just for our listeners, we're always buying these sophomore quarterbacks. I know sometimes it can feel expensive when a rookie quarterback has an impressive season, but that biggest leap is usually experienced in that second season, or at least the most impressive that they're going to look will usually be in that second season for a quarterback. So I'm a big fan of buying any sophomore quarterback, especially if they put that early NFL production on the field. And yeah, we love the skill set for the Herb kid, obviously. But at the same time, I was actually really kind of underwhelmed by the coaching hires. Maybe it was just my Dable love and all that, but hopefully, I don't really know what to expect from the offensive coordinator just because he wasn't very successful in Detroit. And then we didn't really know what his role was. Like I've tried to find information about what the hell he did in New Orleans, but I just can't seem to find out what he was doing there.
Yeah. It's always tough with offensive coordinator stuff. Not only that, but I've talked about this on my show a lot, but oftentimes offensive coordinator data just has a ton of noise because, a lot of times it's just driven by the personnel that they had. It's the old Kyle Shanahan feeds his ex-receiver narrative that was out there for years when, guys, he's going to feed Andre Johnson and Julio Jones. Why would he not be feeding those guys? And then where's that narrative now? It doesn't exist because his team isn't the same, right? So there's a lot of noise to that kind of data, but I do generally look at philosophy and pass rate and stuff and what they do in neutral scripts. And if you can see some correlation and connection there, I do think it's important.
Yeah, especially that neutral game passing game pass to rush ratio. I totally agree. That's one of the biggest ones you're looking at. And just touch on that really quick. Like I've whined about coaches so much in this segment, I should probably offer my thoughts that it's really similar to the conversation you just had there where, I mentioned that a lot of these teams want to run that outside scheme, and so a lot of these coaches that are getting hired or not getting hired are not getting hired because, you're not going to hire an Eric Bieniemy to come in and run an outside zone scheme like Kyle Shanahan runs. You just wouldn't do that because he'd be an inexperienced outside zone run scheme mind. So I want to throw that out there so I don't sound like a dummy.
No, tis the season to be diving into these coaching changes for sure. One place that does have some continuity as far as coaching that we're going to move to is the Green Bay Packers. We've talked about a little bit about Aaron Rodgers this year and that 48 touchdown season that he had. We've been talking touchdown rate, and he had a 9.1% touchdown rate. So he bested Lamar's 2019 by a whole 0.1%. I'm curious, JJ, there's a lot of turmoil around Aaron Rodgers in this role and who they drafted last year and who they didn't draft last year. I'm curious, what do you think the future holds for him, and is it in Green Bay?
I think it's in Green Bay. I think that there's a lot of sort of taking the quote that he had this past week and just sort of inflating it, making it a bigger deal than it needs to be. The guy's coming off a big loss. He's not happy. And then you look back and they had a draft where they didn't really get immediate impact players. And so he's probably frustrated, right?
Yeah.
And I can't really blame him. So, I think he's going to be back in Green Bay because they don't really have much of a choice. I mean, they would likely love to have him back. He has a choice. He could leave if any player can leave and like retire if they want to, and then try to find another team. But I think he will be back. And then, just looking at what he did this season, and I already alluded to this earlier. I feel like he's going to be the easiest guy to fade among top quarterbacks, just because he doesn't bring that rushing element the same way other guys do. And that touchdown rate, not only was it 9.1%, that's the second highest in NFL history.
Mm-hmm.
Lamar was second highest last season, but there was that Peyton Manning 2004 season that still is number one on the list. But if you look at guys who hit like an 8% touchdown rate or even a 7% touchdown rate, the following year, you see that drop by about 3 percentage points, which is exactly what we saw with Lamar Jackson this past year. And I would imagine we're going to see something similar with Aaron Rodgers next year.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. I think, a lot of people are going to be looking at what they do and do they finally add receivers for him. And I think if they do add a significant receiver, that's only avenue for him to repeat. You really got to be careful of that and buying into the fact that's going to happen again, because it's most likely not. I do like the prospects of the offense if they add another significant receiver, or to be honest, if they don't add a significant receiver, I like those weapons there. But I'm kind of with you. I think that he's probably going to price himself out based on the perception that he's going to do what he did this year once again. So yeah, are you kind of in that camp too, where he's just going to be way too pricey for us to be taking in our drafts? Perfect, Ty. Why don't you get us into Russ here?
Yeah, so Russ Wilson, a guy who has had some pretty sticky touchdown rates considering the state of how, the instability of touchdown rates. So I've cited some win rates as well tonight. They're pretty noisy in themselves, and it could be sketchy using best ball win rates for arguments outside of that format. And that couldn't be more true with Russell Wilson, because his win rates are pretty exceptional. He consistently falls into elite hit rates buckets. But that doesn't really reflect what it's like to have owned Russell Wilson over the last couple of years. This year, he was, the quarterback 1 overall, weeks 1 to 8, quarterback 11 from that point on. The year before, he was the quarterback 2 after week 8, just behind Lamar Jackson. From weeks 9 on, Russ was the quarterback 14. So, JJ, what do you make of the first half versus second half Russ splits? And does it move him down this elite quarterback tier for you?
Yeah, it does. I think it has to, because that it exists, and that he's shown that floor for not just 1 or 2 weeks sporadically, but it's been through a long sustained time, right? And that's the fear, is that I do think that a lot of what we're seeing with these splits is that there's some variance that just happens, but you also can look at the fact that this is a team that has a head coach and a coaching staff that believes in running the football and thinks that that's a very important thing to do, and they want to do it more frequently. And when they let Russ cook is really when he was able to just go nuts from a fantasy perspective. I just don't know if we're going to see that. So I think that's at least in the back of our minds. And if you're comparing him to a Josh Allen or some of the other guys in this list who we know are in these good offenses who can run the ball well and who have that ceiling, then why would we not go for one of them instead of going for a Russell Wilson? So yeah, to me, he's in this tier because we know the ceiling is high. He's a QB1 by him being in this tier is what I mean. He has that ceiling, but I think that he has a scarier floor than almost anyone on that list.
Yeah, it was definitely an interesting year in the Pacific Northwest. You mentioned I think it was the touchdown rate in the first little while. He had the most touchdowns of anybody in the first 3 games of a season. I think it was 14, which was just like wild to see. And obviously DK was a big beneficiary of that. So JJ, I'm going to get us into a couple more guys. I'm going to fly through these ones, and then Ty's going to take us out of the quarterback talk for a couple other questions. First guy I want to run through is Joe Burrow, though. Just looked on the True North site, and we have Joe Burrow as our consensus quarterback 8 for Dynasty. And I'm curious to hear where you think that he fits among this quarterback hierarchy with all these big names, being a rookie who looked really good but had that devastating injury. Is he someone you're targeting in that range?
Yeah, so look, if he were 100% healthy, I would easily call him my late round quarterback right now. If I knew for a fact that Burrow was going to be playing week 1 and that health wasn't a deal breaker for him, I would be going with Joe Burrow. I mean, he has great weapons. T. Higgins looks like a stud. Tyler Boyd in the slot. They might even beef that up a little bit. I saw Kyle Pitts mocked to the Bengals, and I'm thinking to myself, my goodness, I can't handle this right now. But I mean, I still think they need to go offensive line, though. It's probably more important for them. But you got to think they're going to beef up the offensive line a little bit. And then the other thing, too, is that the Zach Taylor offense the last 2 years has been one of the most pass-heavy offenses in football. The craziest thing ever, 2 years ago when they were terrible, when they went like 1-15 or whatever. 2 years ago, not only so usually with bad teams, you see them have really high pass rates because they're trailing all the time, right? There's negative game scripts all the time. 2 years ago, they had a higher pass rate in neutral game scripts than they did when they were in terms of total pass rate, like no matter the game script. And so it just shows you that they want to throw the football. That's what they do. And that wasn't even with Joe Burrow, right? So they continue to throw the ball a lot this year with Burrow. The offensive line should be better. And then again, I go back to touchdown rate because it's a really easy way to view how the market's going to view a guy versus what regression's going to say and do. And Joe Burrow had a low touchdown rate this year because there were things that he didn't do well. I mean, he wasn't a great deep ball passer, and you hope that he can improve on that. But he was able to do that in college, so you have at least some sort of a backbone. I just think he's a really good prospect. So all of that combined, I think there's a lot of reason to be absolutely in love with Burrow. The problem is the injury. If the injury didn't exist, I'd be all in, but the injury exists. So from at least a 2021 perspective, I can't be absolutely all in.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at too. And it's weird because I haven't heard a ton about the recovery. And usually with those like super devastating ones, you see updates here and there, but I haven't seen too much there. So I'm with you. Like I might be hesitant on my season long leagues next year, but definitely putting out feelers in those dynasty leagues because I think this passing offense, like we could be looking at a top 5 passing offense, especially obviously due to volume. If we look at volume in 2022, and then the production should come with old T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd and whoever else they add. So I liked all of that you said about Joe Burrow and the Bungles. Let's go to Tannehill. He had a top 7 season. He was the quarterback 7. He actually had a pretty decent year in those rushing touchdowns. He had 7 this season, which was definitely interesting for him, his best year in that category. I'm curious to see if you think he's going to be, with all these big names, with all that upside, is he going to be the ultimate arbitrage play at quarterback in 2021? As a guy who people might be a little hesitant on because of the offense that he plays in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he's definitely a good late round option. He was a good late round option this year because he had the rushing upside, right? I do think that, those rushing touchdowns probably aren't going to be there next year. And then you can't dismiss Arthur Smith being gone and what that might do to the offense as well. So, do I think that he has like true cute top 3 quarterback upside? I mean, I guess technically he does because he did that down the stretch 2 seasons ago, I should say. Do I think that's likely to hit? Probably not. But I think that if you're finding a guy who you can draft late who will exceed ADP, it's probably Ryan Tannehill.
Yeah, I like that too. I mean, along with those 7 rushing touchdowns, 34 passing touchdowns this season seems like it could potentially be a little bit high for him, like you said there with Arthur Smith leaving. So I'm not necessarily going to bank on those numbers repeating, but I do think he does have that rushing that comes along with him. And so, I mean, back end quarterback 1, that's where he is for me. And I think he's, like you said, he's going to be a value in drafts again. Versus all of these big names that we've been talking about. So I like that. And I know our man, Will Harris, creator of Viridian Global, who's the biggest Tannehill truther that you've ever met, is probably going to love all of this because he's a huge Tanny guy. And shout out to our friends at Viridian Global. While I said it there, they are the makers of all of our merch. You see the shirt behind me. Yeah, thank you to them. We got lots of cool stuff. They just did a lot of work to revamp that shop. So appreciate Viridian Global. Okay, Ty, get into it, man.
Yeah, that red zone touchdown rate coming down for the Titans. So lots of good points there, boys. Sorry, Will. I think we put a lot of context into 2020 for the quarterback position. And as sobering as it all is, as much as I love to reflect on the season that was, I wouldn't mind capping off the quarterback position, just looking towards the 2021 draft. And JJ, we've kind of gone through a lot of this stuff, whether it's attacking the back of your tiers, whether it's establishing that there will be a good amount of quarterbacks in those mid rounds of fantasy drafts next year. But how do you think you will actually be attacking the position in your drafts?
Yeah, I mean,
your handle is at the late round quarterback.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly similar to what I did this past year. It's just that it just depends on what the market ends up doing, and where ADP ends up falling. Because really, that's what the late round quarterback strategy is about. It's about recognizing value through the market as opposed to being the last person to draft a quarterback and treating it like a game of chicken. So yeah, I mean, I think that next season I'm probably going to look at that top tier and say, there's like 7 or 8 guys who I think can be the true QB1 in fantasy football. So I will be okay getting one of those, the last one in that tier. Otherwise, I'll end up waiting and getting a guy. Hopefully, Joe Burrow's healthy. Maybe a Tannehill if I just need that floor and I can feel get a safer option. If Justin Herbert falls, that's fine. So I think there's a lot of variety. The one thing I will say though is that if ADP, if we're seeing guys being drafted in the 2nd, 3rd, and even the 4th round on average, it just doesn't seem necessary. There's still, despite the fact that these guys are giving you an edge, there's still a decent tier of players, a decent number of players in a 12-team league. If there's 8 of them, you should be able to wait at least a little bit. So I'm still not going to be an early round quarterback drafter.
Totally. And, I love that you've brought that up a couple times. Like, we really don't know where the market's going to be until best balls kind of have provided us with some of that average draft position data. And I think that is going to be really interesting. And not that best ball is the best reflection of what's going to happen in your seasonal leagues in a few months, but it's at least a jumping off point where we can see where some of the sharper minds are penciling these quarterbacks in, because I do think it's interesting how unprecedented the waters are right now for that eternal struggle of staying ahead of a trend in fantasy football and sticking to rules of thumbs that have been so successful in the past. And I do think that, what JJ's saying is that we do find that habitable zone for each position to be drafting. So, like an astronomer is looking at a solar system far away to find a habitable zone for a planet, we do the same thing with positions in fantasy drafts. So fellers, with that, I want to take it kind of that way. Like, I'm going to shift gears pretty hard here. But I'm happy we hammered some of that quarterback stuff. I can't thank you enough for joining us, JJ, but there's, because there's nobody else we'd want their opinion more when it comes to quarterbacks. But to my point off the top of the show, JJ, I think you're an elite process articulator. And on your most recent episode at the Late Round Podcast, you touched on a topic that is very near and dear to my fantasy heart about the running back position. It's a concept widely known as the running back dead zone. And the loose translation for everybody, running backs drafted in rounds 3 to 6, about that range, have very bad hit rates. Talking like the percentage of running backs drafted in those rounds to score 200 fantasy points, the likelihood of them scoring 250 fantasy points, and so on. And it's so glaring that the hit rates are comparable to running backs drafted in, say, rounds 7 through 9 or so. On top of that, the wide receiver position has spectacular hit rates in this exact range of the fantasy draft. So it's where a good portion of the breakout wide receivers every season are coming from, in that 3 to 6 round range. So, JJ, feel free to correct or expand on any of that. But I would love to get your take on how many running backs do you think kind of end up in front of that dead zone cliff? Is it 15 or 20? And also, are you comfortable with basically a modified zero RB strategy, like heading into the 7th round of a draft with just one running back on your roster?
Yeah, so it depends on your league and the scoring and all that kind of stuff. Like if you're in a standard scoring league, there's no need to go zero RB. But if you're in a typical 3 wide receiver flex full PPR type format, I mean I go modified zero RB. I usually don't go full on zero RB, but I'll go modified zero RB in probably 80 to 90% of my drafts. That's just what the math shows. And you hit on it a lot with I looked at last season. I did an article, or last offseason, I did an article in a podcast on where we find league-winning players in fantasy football. And I won't get into the specific numbers of everything or anything like that. But basically what I did was I mapped out over the last decade where there were clear drop-offs looking at postseason results at running back and wide receiver at each position, at both of those positions. And it was very clear that after the RB10, there was a big drop off. And then after the wide receiver 8, there was a big drop off. So I use that as the baseline for being league winning players, which you can use league winning in a lot of different ways. It's just the way that I defined it for the purposes of this article. So the question I asked was, where do we draft top 8 wide receivers and top 10 running backs? And what I found was top 8 wide receivers are being drafted at a higher rate in the early rounds than top 10 running backs are being drafted in the early rounds. And if you look at it, the rate in getting a league winning running back in round 6 versus round 4, this is just random, but it's just a good example over this time frame is from 2011 through 2019, round 6 versus round 4, you've had a higher rate of hitting on a league winning running back in round 6 than you have in round 4 over the last 8 or 9 years. And so if you look at round 4 and 5, the rate in hitting on one of those players is basically completely comparable to round 6 through 8. So there's really no reason to get a running back in that range unless you feel, I'm not someone who says absolutely never do this. It's a strategy thing, right? Strategy is to increase your probability, not to just go blindly doing something. Like I liked James Conner and Jonathan Taylor in that zone this year. Hit on Jonathan Taylor, didn't hit on James Conner. That's going to happen, but I also largely avoided, like I had no Todd Gurley, I had no, just a lot of the guys that were in that range in general who just busted this year. Right. And so that's basically the gist of it. And I think that the reason this exists, again, I always, every time I find something in data, I try to find if there's a logical reason for this happening. And I try to hypothesize as to why. And so I think with the running back thing, we know every year that there are, let's say 5 to 7, 5 to 8 running backs, sometimes more because you could stretch a little bit, but that have true workhorse bell cow workloads in store, right? This year, usually they're all drafted in the top 6 or 7. But even this past year, you could get down to like an Aaron Jones in the 2nd round, and you could say, yeah, I see it at least. At least he has the receiving component, right? So what happens is that we know that running backs are very, very important in fantasy football. And so when people go wide receiver or tight ends early, they get to round 3 and 4 and 5, and they say, well, crap, I need a running back. And so what they do is they just reach and they force that running back pick. And that devalues the position where you're getting guys that are in more questionable situations than you otherwise would. So you're getting guys like a Todd Gurley where we don't know what his workload's really gonna look like. We get a guy like David Johnson where we don't know exactly what his workload's gonna look like. And a lot of times these guys are good early down runners, but they don't necessarily have a receiving component to their game, or they're in a split backfield and they're in a committee like Cam Akers, and we're just guessing that they're gonna be the lead guy. I know that Cam Akers emerged down the stretch, but Cam Akers was not a good fantasy asset this year. Totally. So that's generally what happens. I think it's just more of a psychological thing where, fantasy managers are sitting there and they're forcing the issue and getting a running back, and they're creating reasons as to why they should get that guy. But realistically, you're better off just waiting till round 6, 7, or 8, because you're going to have a similar hit rate as you will in round 3, 4, and 5. Well, more so 4 and 5 than round 3.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I like what you said, like not making it black and white. Like what I usually do is find that point in my rankings for running back, say it's running back 17 or whatever. And that's kind of my cliff. You know what I mean? Like this is my clear tier break. Right into the next Skeletors that I don't want. And I agree that usually there is pretty glaring issues with them. And I also think people get worried about, getting too far in a draft, and also worrying that they don't really realize that you can stockpile and you can hit rates by doing exactly that, like having 3 in that range. So you're really playing the math at that point. Maybe I'm trying too hard to make connections here, JJ, but because we like to attack our draft in a specific way, is there any chance some of the quarterback trends we've hit on end up conflicting with wanting to stockpile running backs in, say, that 6th to 9th round range?
As in we're going to change and get quarterbacks earlier, and then as a result, it could. We could see a slight difference. I mean, the thing is too, one of the things that I've really been like thinking, because tight ends, and there's such a clear tight end tier at the top, right? With a Kelsey, a Waller, Kittle, and what I'm seeing is that sure, you can get your running back early, but then there's going to be a very, very clear line that you draw, right, to where you feel fine not getting a running back and getting a tight end instead. But then on top of that, at the wide receiver position, we are seeing, despite Devontae Adams' season, despite Tyreek Hill's season and what have you, we are seeing flatter distribution at wide receiver. And so what that means is the opportunity cost in getting those guys earlier is a little bit, and this is what I could have brought up too with quarterbacks, but the opportunity cost in getting those guys earlier, it's a little bit easier to take on, right? Because you're not missing out on a running back that you really, really want. And that wide receiver does have a little bit more depth, even though it's overstated. It does have a little bit more depth than it has traditionally, which means you're not really foregoing a huge opportunity and missing out on that wide receiver. So as a result, you can feel a little bit better about taking on tight end more in particular, but maybe a quarterback too. Yeah, I mean, it could shift the way that you sort of view drafts from that perspective.
Nice, gentlemen. So I got one to keep us on the running back train here, and then we're getting pretty close to the end here, gentlemen. JJ, you recently, I think a couple weeks ago, had a really good tweet about how running back target share has been trending down over the last 3 years league wide. It was a really nice little table that showed all those percentages, and it's a pretty stark difference from 2018 to now. It doesn't look like it in the percentage, but if you look at how many targets that is for running backs, it is quite a difference. I'm wondering, like, when you are looking at teams and you're trying to figure out, where they're going to distribute those running back targets, what kind of things are you looking for when you're looking to nab those guys who are the pass catchers in those offenses?
Yeah. So, from a player projection standpoint, the thing that's going to be stickiest year over year is always going to be volume. So if a running back saw 100 targets last year, chances are he's not going to see 7 targets the following season. Right. So volume is sticky year over year, but if you look at that chart, and if you look at, really, I think this year was more glaring than any other season, because we had some quarterbacks, a decent amount of quarterbacks changing teams, and guys like a Phillip Rivers in particular, who was at a team for a really long time, where we have this really big sample of Phillip Rivers on the Chargers, and we got to see what happens when he goes to a different team. And what we saw was Indianapolis saw a spike in running back target share. And if you look at this is very, like, I haven't done any sort of testing on this and like deep research, but if you look at the way running back target shares fluctuate, it does seem for the most part that they're pretty strongly tied to 2 things. One of them being that there's not a lot of alternative options, but then the other one being that it's quarterback driven, that it's the quarterback who's targeting those players. And so Phillip Rivers going to, leaving the Chargers, they don't see as high of a target share this season. With Justin Herbert, wasn't as bad as it could have been, but if Tyrod Taylor were under center, it would have been way worse. Yeah. But I'm speculating a little bit, but I do think that dumping the ball off is very much a quarterback related thing. And then from a general trends standpoint, everything we talked about earlier with quarterbacks and the quarterback rushing component and that becoming more and more important, I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing, aside from the injuries to like CMC and Saquon Barkley, like, of course, we're going to see somewhat of a dip, but the drastic dip could easily be the dual threat abilities of these quarterbacks, where if they're under pressure, they're not dumping the ball off as much, and instead they're taking off and running. And so if you look at a chart of the top teams in terms of running back rush share this past season, the only team ranked in the top 16, the top half of the league that had a mobile quarterback was Cam Newton. And that team had the worst wide receiving group in the league. So of course, not only that, but that offense is historically, they always target running backs anyway in New England. So we knew that that's a thing. And then you look at the bottom of the list, it's Lamar Jackson, it's Josh Allen. It's even Russell Wilson was middle of the pack. It's the way that these quarterbacks generally operate. So if you're going to get more mobile quarterbacks and dual threat quarterbacks in the league, that's probably going to lower the target shares for the running backs on their teams to some degree. Now, like I said, this is high level speculation, but I do think it makes some logical sense.
No, totally. I was talking about that a little bit earlier in the season where these guys' legs are their check down, right? Like Lamar Jackson. I don't think we're ever going to see a high target share in Baltimore because Lamar's going to tuck it and run whenever he's got the chance instead of dumping it off to, unfortunately, J.K. Dobbins, which we would love to see. But we just got to make sure that we're realistic about the fact that that's probably not going to happen. So I really like how you put that. And, we're big running back guys ourselves. Ty and myself, we love to see some good running backs, and the landscape is looking pretty nice so far. So definitely some cool things to dive into when we're trying to build our rosters and look for those guys in those later rounds, like who are going to get those targets. Like a guy like, obviously he was injured this year, but Tariq Cohen comes to mind, and those guys who just kind of soak up the targets because they command them, right? So last one, guys. JJ, I know that you are a Steelers fan. Also a Steelers fan is my co-host Tyrell McLaughlin.
There we go.
Waving that extremely terrible towel. So I want to talk a little bit of Steelers with you real quick, because I think there's going to be a lot of talk about that team. Obviously, you talked about James Conner a little bit earlier, and it's curious to see what happens there. But I want to kind of zero in on these wide receivers, JJ, because I think it's just like stud after stud after stud coming out of this wide receiver factory. And we're going to start on Juju. Juju, I love him. I think he's going to be great no matter where he goes. Obviously, this season was a really weird one as far as his production versus his targets and whatnot. But what do you think about Juju's free agency? Do you think it's a foregone conclusion that he walks, or do you think there is a chance that he comes back to the Steelers?
I think there's a chance. I wouldn't put that chance as very high. I think that the only way he stays in Pittsburgh is if he takes a hometown discount, which it's not even his hometown, but just the phrasing. I mean, it's just one of those things where the Steelers are strapped for cash. It just doesn't seem like they need to spend at the position. And especially given the way they utilize their receivers, Juju being mainly a slot guy, it's fairly replaceable. I just don't think that it's a necessary piece to their offense at this point. And there's obviously other glaring holes like on their offensive line they need to address. So to me, Juju's probably gone. I'd probably give it like a 90-ish.
Yeah, I like that. I think so too. And I think he was kind of misused this past season. Like we saw in that playoff game where he was getting some targets down the field and he had a monster game. They just didn't necessarily give him that many opportunities for that during the season, because I think his average depth of target, and Ty, correct me if I'm wrong as well, I think it was like 5.6 yards or something this year.
I don't have it in front of me, but he did have the lowest receiving yards of any wide receiver in NFL history. There's 202 of them who have had over 90 catches in a season, and his receiving total was the lowest of any of them.
Yeah, so I'm on team free Juju, because I think he can do a lot more with that many targets if he's getting them a little bit further downfield. And JJ, real quick, like obviously we're going to pretend that Juju is still a Steelers wideout. I want you to rank those three wideouts for Dynasty, because I think Claypool was looking hot. I will say that Claypool he lives probably about 2 hours away from us up here in Canada. We are very proud of what he's been doing, and we like him. And then Deontay, Ty and myself are big fans of Deontay as well. I know I have him in like my top 15 dynasty wide receivers. So I'm curious to see how you rank these three. I know it was really difficult in season to rank them, but now that we can kind of let ourselves breathe off of that week to week, how do you think it shakes out for these guys?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's difficult ranking them after the season too.
True.
It's to me. So to me, there's a lot of I'm excited about the Steelers offense from the perspective of Matt Canada coming in, and not only because his last name is elite, of course,
yes.
but because he's a coordinator that I cannot stand coordinators, and honestly, Bruce Arians kind of falls. I've mentioned this earlier, where He's a guy who has his scheme and he just fits his players within his scheme and goes from there. Matt Canada is someone who looks at the players that he has and morphs and molds his scheme around those players. So I'm excited about that. That's something that's been consistent with him. So, the thing with Deontay Johnson this year, I'm with you guys. I'm a big Deontay stan, was huge into him entering the season. A lot of people look at his low average at the target and they say, he's overrated because he's not getting the ball down the field and he's not very efficient. But good players get the ball, period. If you're getting targeted, that means they want the ball in your hands or you're getting open. And that's a good thing. That's why volume is sticky year over year, because it's a sign that you're good. And so I'm not concerned about that at all. With that being said, if you look at what a true alpha wide receiver who has that true wide receiver one overall in fantasy football, if you look at what that could be and what that mold really looks like, Chase Claypool kind of fits that. I mean, he's got all the physical tools you want, lines up all over the field. They utilize him a lot. They utilized him a ton in the red zone this year. He just wasn't getting the playing time we wanted. Part of that was just Mike Tomlin literally saying that he didn't want to throw him in there too fast. So to me, I think Chase Claypool has a better ceiling than Deontay Johnson does. I think Deontay's a safer bet. But I think they're like back to back in my rankings. I have Claypool ahead of them, and then I have Juju below them only because of ambiguity. We don't know. Yeah. We don't know what's going to happen. He could land somewhere awful again. But yeah, I mean, I think talent wise, Juju has it. It's just a matter of we don't know what his situation kind of looks like.
Yeah, Ty, as the other Steelers fan, I'd like to let you weigh in on that great debate as well.
Like ranking all three of them?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I notice is how closely they bunch, because then it probably there's a little bit of roster construction rabbit hole we can go down to, like what kind of wide receiver are you going to profile at that point of the draft. I'm always not going to target somebody like a Juju Smith-Schuster in that point of the draft. I'll already have a Keenan Allen or somebody on my roster, but so like I'll probably end up gravitating more to Claypool. But it really is just remarkable how close these guys bunch. And I think a lot of this conversation is what do you think of Juju? Do you think he's going to go somewhere? And like looking at Juju and Deontay, it's not just the lack of air yards that are concerning. It's the lack of yards after the catch. Like Juju was putting up historic yards after the catch totals in 2018 and 2017, his rookie and sophomore year. Yeah. Those have just totally evaporated. He's dropped significantly in yards after the catch per reception and yards per target in all 4 of the seasons in the league. And we know, like, obviously this guy isn't an X wide receiver, Juju, but I really don't know if he's anything other than an 80+% slot wide receiver. So I know the market is just going to be way higher on Juju than I am. And, when it comes to Deontay Johnson, I just think he might jump the shark a little bit. Like, I like Deontay Johnson a lot. I just don't know if he's not going to be the biggest victim of this offense changing a little bit over the offseason and them putting a little bit of emphasis on trying to have somewhat of a semblance of a running game in 2021. So I think there's a lot to shake out. Like, this might be one of the teams that's the most in flux at this point because of some of the salary cap stuff. Like, I know Pouncey retiring Vance McDonald puts us to like 20 mil over, and we do have like 170 plus cap space in 2022. So there's a lot of things that the Steelers could do from now until free agency that'll definitely send us some smoke signals. But yeah, I think Juju's gone, so I'm definitely going to put him at the bottom of my rankings for this time being. Deontay, I have a little bit ahead of Claypool, but I definitely will gravitate towards Claypool just because he does have that tremendous upside, and because I just kind of think he wins in every way, and he has this immense upside. I also think he kind of hit a rookie wall last year. Like, we saw that with kind of his fantasy scoring and just a little bit lack of trust that was shown in him down the stretch was kind of odd to me. So hopefully Claypool is really worked in throughout this offseason. Hopefully there's a little more continuity that builds in this offense. And to JJ's point about Matt Canada, he's also been famous for a lot of jet sweeps, a lot of snap motion and things like that. So I think that's another thing that really benefits Chase Claypool. Not to mention if Juju leaves, like, I know it's noisy using vacated volume in an offense that we expect the passing volume to come down, but there will be vacated volume with Connor and him leaving. And a lot of that actually goes into inside the 10-yard line, which is where we actually saw Claypool have 24% of the Steelers targets this season in the most in the area of the field where the most touchdowns are scored. So I really like Chase Claypool next year, and I think he's somebody who has not only just the widest range of outcomes, but somebody I'm definitely going to be targeting in that 5th to 6th round range probably.
Yeah, no, I like it. And Claypool definitely put all those skills on display in that game that they had against the Eagles, where he had those 4 touchdowns. I think he got like one of those shovel pass sweeps for a touchdown, just dominated them in the red zone too. So definitely like
20% of
Claypool
his
going.
points in that game.
Yeah, that was huge and heartbreaking at the same time. That was a very bittersweet game for me, actually. But that's a wrap on the episode, fellas. I really, JJ, we cannot thank you enough for coming on the pod. It was absolutely our honor to have you join and share some of your wisdom. So we really appreciate that. I hope we did it some justice earlier in the show, but I'd like for you to have a chance to talk about where the people can find you and what kind of stuff you might be working on this offseason.
Yeah, sure. I'm on Twitter at Late Round QB, and I have my podcast, the Late Round Podcast. That's sort of my baby at this point, in the space. We'll be doing studies and whatnot all off season, getting into prospecting now, which is really fun, and a good time updating my prospect models and stuff, and doing all that. So yeah, I mean, I'm publishing a couple podcasts a week, 2 a week for the Late Round Podcast, and then. Just be on the lookout for any articles that drop throughout the offseason.
Absolutely. Love it. You got any parting words, Ty?
Well, just that podcast. Like, everyone needs to make sure they're checking it out at the Late Round Pod. Like, it is the neutron star of fantasy football podcast. It is just so condensed. Like, it is incredible.
Yeah, it's perfect. Like it's amazing to me how much information you put into such a short period of time while making it still something that you can digest and understand exactly what you're saying. That's definitely an art, and you've got it down pat. So thank you for all your work, JJ, just being an inspiration for all of us in the industry and somebody that we can look up to and use as a resource as well as respect as an analyst. So thank you for that, my man. As we ride out here, I just want to give another thanks to Monkey Knife Fight. We appreciate them, as well as Viridian Global, the makers of our merch. Shout out to Mark and Will there. Until next week, guys, we've got the guest train rolling still. We've got Tyler Gunther coming on next week. So we're super excited for that. And once again, JJ, thank you so much. And to anybody out there, make sure you hit subscribe on the YouTube channel or keep your eyes peeled for tomorrow when that audio is going to drop. So have a great weekend, guys. And let's look forward to this Super Bowl, eh?
Thanks, JJ.
Peace.